Lou Hamilton of Audible Elegance here in Cincinnati, Ohio. We have a website, audibleelegance.com. Please do visit it during our 40th anniversary sale. I know everybody's just itching for me to get rid of my favorite whiteboard, but it's back. All right. One of the elements that existed on audio equipment for years was the loudness button. And most people have noticed, some have expressed disappointment, that there's no longer a loudness button on their electronics. So let me explain what the loudness button was for, who was doing it right, and why it doesn't exist. And it's not about cost savings, okay? A switch and a circuit doesn't cost squat when you're talking hundreds of units. You have to understand that the loudness button came around as a result of work done by Fletcher and Munson on the development of the hand telephone. Some of you may recognize them in antique stores. No, they're not military supplies. We actually used those and lived by them. We also didn't have to pay $1,000 a year for telephone service either, but we'll go there another day. Okay, what they discovered was that 20,000, that our hearing was more like a bell-shaped curve. Now, what we're very good at is essentially, let's call it 500 to 800. And this is not exact, but it's giving you a general idea, okay? So if someone wants to nitpick, go ahead. But our hearing sensitivity was designed for human communications and became less sensitive as you went down in frequency, and is not particularly good down in real low frequencies at low volume. In other words, our ancestors were never killed by a lion with a synthesizer. Therefore, we did not need to hear that frequency if he was at a distance. But we did need to communicate with one another. Similarly, our sensitivity in upper frequency falls away, and yet in history we've yet to see a hummingbird with an AK-47. Now, this is just one curve, because as you turn the volume up, the curve slowly becomes a little different and becomes less of a hard bell. It begins to flatten out. So you can look at books with the curves, and you'll see that they plotted out like 10 or 12 curves based upon volume and how our hearing reacted to the different frequencies. The loudness button, typically found on most electronics, was essentially a sort of composite of all of these curves, principally focused in the low frequency. Very few did anything about the upper end. And the problem is that this composite average was either insufficient or an exaggeration of the bass, depending upon the volume. And where this became very problematic is that people wanted their systems to hum. You know, they're playing it fairly loud, on goes the loudness button, and now we got a thumping baby. The backside of that is it also took a lot more power to run the bass area. So you had instances of damaging the speakers of insufficient power from the amplifier section, or the amplifier itself kissing the death itself, because people wanted it at the thump. So it had some backdraws to it. But there was one manufacturer who did it right and was never recognized for it, and that was Yamaha. If you look at some of the vintage Yamaha pieces, they don't have a single loudness button. They have a button that allows you to engage loudness, but then they have a dial. I think it was numbered 1 through 10, and just so people would have a reference. And the loudness they designed was more representative of each of the Fletcher Munson curves. Risk of damage was one of it, to either the speakers and or the electronics itself. And the other thing that slowly creeped in was a recognition that the more switches you have in the signal path, it degraded the quality of electrical performance sound of the system. So you've also seen bass and treble controls essentially disappear. They're probably a little more costly because of the nature of those circuitries, so maybe there was some cost savings to that. But again, how well they were used and how appropriately they were used varied. But this is what is ultimately why the loudness button fundamentally disappeared. We have some people going with a different response of getting back to that loudness, which is essentially called the improper setting of the subwoofer so that it plays louder than it should. So you still get thump therapy. You know, there we are on that. So this is the end of the loudness. This is how the loudness was learned and how Yamaha did it right, and everybody else had a single button, which was a composite and wrong.